The grand ballroom of Meridian Station hung suspended between stars and silence. 300 years ago, Queen Valeria would have marveled at such a place. A diplomatic hall carved from the darkness of space itself, rotating slowly above Earth's pale blue curve, hosting delegates from 17 worlds under a ceiling of manufactured sky. Now she simply noted the exits, calculated the political weight of each conversation cluster, and waited for the evening to end. She had attended 10,000 such gatherings in her long life, perhaps more. After the first few centuries, they blurred together into an endless succession of careful words and cautious gestures, each one a chess move in games that never truly ended, only paused between functions. The dress she wore moved like liquid shadow across her shoulders. Black silk imported from Earth, tailored on her flagship by hands that knew better than to touch her skin while measuring. It caught the ambient light from the bioluminescent panels lining the walls, panels that shifted through diplomatic blues and cautious greens as the crowd's collective mood rose and fell, like breathing. The gown made her look striking, untouchable, exactly as intended. Valeria stood near one of the observation windows where the station's hull curved away into transparency, offering a view of the void beyond. Other delegates gave her space. They always did. 10 feet minimum, an invisible barrier she'd grown so accustomed to that she sometimes forgot it existed at all. Except on nights like this, when the distance felt less like respect and more like exile. She watched the dancers move through their patterns on the polished floor. A Martian official guided his partner through what might have been a waltz, though the algorithmic music made it difficult to tell. The station's entertainment systems had composed something mathematically designed to offend no one, which meant it pleased no one either. Still, people danced, they laughed, they touched each other's hands without flinching. 347 years, Valeria thought, 200 of them alone. The memory rose unbidden, as it always did at gatherings like this. Jonathan's face, his human warmth, the way he'd looked at her and seen a woman first, a queen second, a vampire third. She pushed the thought away with practiced efficiency. 2 centuries was long enough to master the art of not remembering. Your Majesty, Lord Cassius materialized at her elbow with the characteristic silence of their kind. 400 years old, pale as winter, he wore his age in the careful precision of his movements. The Centauri delegation wishes to discuss the mining rights before the evening concludes, and the Titan ambassador has requested hours later. Valeria kept her eyes on the dancers. I'm watching. Lord Cassius followed her gaze. His expression, neutral as always, betrayed nothing. But she'd known him for over a century. She could read the concern in the angle of his shoulders, the way his fingers rested against his formal jacket. You used to dance, he said quietly. I used to do many things. Your Majesty. Cassius, she turned to face him fully. I appreciate your concern. I appreciate your service. I appreciate that you've stood beside me through treaties and tribunals and more diplomatic functions than either of us can count. But tonight, for just a few hours, I would like to simply stand here and watch people enjoy themselves without analyzing the political implications. He inclined his head. Of course, Your Majesty. I'll be near the delegation clusters if you require anything. When he withdrew, taking the rest of her small entourage with him, Valeria felt something close to relief. Solitude within solitude. She'd become an expert at it. The music shifted into something with a Latin rhythm. A human couple near the center of the floor adapted smoothly, their movements, synchronized in a way that suggested years of practice or genuine connection. Perhaps both. Valeria found herself noting the precise angles of their steps, the way the woman anticipated her partner's movements half a second before they happened. She could dance like that, had danced like that once, before duty and loss and 200 years of careful distance had taught her that some pleasures carried costs too high to pay. A laugh drifted across the ballroom, bright and genuine above the algorithmic music. Valeria's eyes tracked toward the sound, a young woman from the Jupiter delegation spinning with abandon while her partner tried to keep up. No calculation in it, no political weight, just joy. When was the last time I felt joy, Valeria wondered. Not satisfaction at a treaty well negotiated, not the grim pleasure of a rival outmaneuvered, just simple, uncomplicated joy. She couldn't remember. The thought settled over her shoulders like a weight. 347 years. Ruler of the Sanguine territories, sovereign over domains that stretched across 3 star systems, respected by every species in known space. And tonight, standing in a ballroom full of people, she was utterly, completely alone. The loneliness rose up sharp and sudden, cutting through centuries of carefully maintained composure. Valeria closed her eyes against it. This was foolish. She was a queen. Queens didn't stand at windows wishing for things they'd given up centuries ago. Queens didn't watch others dance and feel their hearts ache with longing for something as simple as human touch. Queens endured. When she opened her eyes again, she saw him. Thaddeus Brennan had attended exactly 47 diplomatic functions in his 18 months as Earth's cultural liaison, and he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was one wrong word away from accidentally starting an interstellar incident. The fact that he'd already caused 3 minor diplomatic incidents, one involving cheese, one involving a misunderstanding about eye contact, and one he still didn't fully understand, but which required a formal written apology to Venus, didn't help his confidence. He stood near one of the support columns, nursing what passed for wine in this carefully neutral environment. The glass contained something blue and vaguely alcoholic that tasted like disappointment had been distilled and served at precisely room temperature. Around him, delegates from 17 worlds navigated conversations with the practiced ease of people who knew exactly which words might cause offense and which might open doors. Tad had no such ease. He'd learned over 18 months to smile at the right moments, nod seriously when people discussed things he didn't understand, and above all, never ever offer cheese to anyone without checking their species' dietary restrictions first. "You look like you're planning your escape route." Tad turned to find Elliot Graves standing beside him, holding his own glass of blue disappointment. Elliot was 35, 3 years younger than Tad, but somehow managed to navigate diplomatic functions without causing international incidents. This made him simultaneously Tad's closest colleague and most exhausting point of comparison. "I'm planning my 5th escape route," Tad corrected. "The first 4 all led past groups of people who might want to discuss agricultural subsidies. I'm trying to find a path that involves minimal conversation about crop yields." Elliot smiled. "You could try actually engaging with people. That's why we're here. I engaged with the Venusian ambassador last month. You remember how that ended. The cheese wasn't your fault. How were you supposed to know they consider dairy products spiritually offensive? By reading the briefing packet, like you told me to do, 3 times. Well," Elliot took a sip of his drink and grimaced, "at least you're memorable. Some liaisons serve for years and nobody remembers their names. You've been here 18 months and you're already a cautionary tale in 3 different embassy briefings." Tad wasn't sure whether to feel proud or horrified. He settled for taking another drink of blue disappointment and watching the crowd. The ballroom stretched before him like a study in controlled chaos. Conversations rose and fell in overlapping waves translated by the station's systems into something his brain could process. Near the center, couples danced to music that seemed designed by committee to be as inoffensive as possible, which meant it had all the emotional resonance of a mathematical equation. Still, people seemed to be enjoying themselves. That was something. Tad's eyes moved across the dancers, the conversation clusters, the delegates positioning themselves for advantage, even in social settings. Politics never stopped, he'd learned. It just changed costumes. Then he saw her. She stood alone near one of the observation windows, framed against the darkness of space beyond. Even from across the ballroom, she commanded attention. Not through movement or gesture, but through absolute stillness. Everyone else in the room seemed frenetic by comparison, like they were all moving slightly too fast while she existed in a different time frame entirely. Her skin was pale enough to catch the ambient light, making her seem to glow faintly against the stars. Black hair fell past her shoulders in waves that absorbed the light around them, creating small pockets of shadow that defied the ballroom's aggressive illumination. The dress she wore moved like it was alive, rippling across her frame with a liquid quality that shouldn't have been possible with any fabric Tad knew. But what caught his attention, what held it, was her expression. She was watching the dancers with a look Tad recognized immediately, having seen it in his own bathroom mirror, more times than he cared to count over the past 2 years. It was the expression of someone who wanted to join in, but had long since stopped expecting anyone to ask. Longing mixed with resignation. Hope that had learned to disguise itself as dignified solitude. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself often enough. Who is that? Tad asked, nodding toward the woman. Elliot followed his gaze. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and something that looked disturbingly like panic. Tad, no. No, what I just asked, who she was. Elliot lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. Don't, just don't. Don't, whatever you're thinking about doing, don't do it. Tad looked at his colleague. Elliot had gone pale, which was impressive given that the ambient lighting was already making everyone look vaguely blue. I'm not thinking about doing anything. I just noticed someone standing alone and wondered who they were. Is that illegal at diplomatic functions now? Should I have filled out a form? Tad? Elliot gripped his arm. I'm serious, that's someone very important. Someone with very specific protocols about how they're approached. Someone you absolutely should not walk up to casually. Why not? Because Elliot struggled for words. Because it's complicated. Because there are procedures. Because you can't just talk to some people like they're your neighbor. Tad looked back at the woman by the window. She'd shifted slightly, and now he could see her profile more clearly. High cheekbones, elegant nose, ears that tapered to subtle points, marking her as one of the many non-human species represented at the gathering. Her eyes, even from this distance, they seemed darker than they should be, like they absorbed light rather than reflected it, and she looked so very, very alone. She's watching the dancers, Tad said quietly. She wants to dance, but nobody's asked her. Tad, how long has she been standing there? I don't, Elliot checked his datapad. She arrived about an hour ago, but that's not the point. The point is, an hour. Tad set down his glass of blue disappointment. She's been standing there for an hour watching people dance and nobody's asked her. There are reasons for that. Are the reasons that she's too important, too intimidating, too surrounded by invisible protocols that say regular people shouldn't approach? Tad straightened his jacket. It was gray, carefully selected to be diplomatically neutral, which meant it made him look slightly washed out and entirely forgettable. Perfect for blending into walls at functions like this. Except tonight he didn't want to blend into walls. What are you doing? Elliot's voice had risen to a strangled whisper. I'm going to ask her to dance. You can't. Why not? Because she's important, because there are hard protocols. Tad looked at his colleague. Elliot, she's standing alone at a party. She wants to dance. Sometimes the right thing to do is the simple thing. Ask the person standing alone if they'd like to dance. Tad listened to me very carefully. Elliot's grip tightened. I know you mean well. I know you see someone who looks lonely and you want to help. But this is different. This person isn't just some delegate you can chat with. There are procedures for approaching them. Security considerations. Political implications. If you walk up there without proper clearance, what's the worst that could happen? She says no. Tad gently extracted his arm from Elliot's grip. I've survived worse rejections. That's not what I'm worried about. But Tad was already moving. He navigated between clusters of delegates, weaving through conversations about trade agreements and territorial disputes past the Martian contingent, discussing something that involved elaborate hand gestures around a group of officials from the outer worlds who had mastered the art of looking interested while clearly thinking about something else entirely. As he walked, he noticed something odd. People moved out of his path. Not just the normal social clearing that happened when someone was walking with purpose, but actual backward steps. A woman from the Jupiter delegation saw where he was heading, and her eyes widened. She actually tugged her companion away, putting more distance between herself and the woman by the window. Tad filed this away as yet another thing he didn't understand about diplomatic functions and kept walking. Up close, she was even more striking. The pale skin had an almost luminescent quality like polished marble that had been kept in carefully controlled climate. Her dark eyes tracked his approach with an expression he couldn't quite read, surprise perhaps mixed with something that might have been curiosity or might have been the first stirrings of alarm. The translation field around her shimmered differently than others in the room, creating small distortions in the air that suggested her words needed extra processing. Or maybe that was just the station's environmental systems acting up. Meridian Station was state-of-the-art, which in Tad's experience meant it had state-of-the-art problems. He stopped in front of her and offered what he hoped was a genuine smile. Not the diplomatic one he'd learned to deploy like a shield, but the real one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. The smile that still hurt a little to use 2 years after he'd last had real reason to smile like that. Would you like to dance? For a moment, she simply stared at him. Tad's brain helpfully provided 17 different ways his simple question might have been catastrophically offensive. Maybe dancing was forbidden for her species. Maybe asking someone to dance without proper introduction was equivalent to a declaration of war. Maybe his tone had been wrong, or his posture, or the way he was breathing. He was mentally composing an apology that would work for at least 12 of those possibilities when her expression transformed. The change was remarkable. Her features softened. The careful distance that had seemed carved into her face melted away to reveal something underneath, something that looked like surprised delight, mixed with an emotion too complex to name. The corners of her mouth curved upward, and suddenly she seemed younger, less remote, more present, more human, though she clearly wasn't. Yes, she said, and her voice was warmer than he'd expected. Like honey that had been left in sunlight, with undertones that suggested depths he couldn't begin to fathom. I would like that very much. When she placed her hand in his, Tad noticed it was cool. Not unpleasantly so, but noticeably cooler than human standard, like touching polished stone that had been kept in shadow. The contact sent a small shock through his system, not electric, but something else. Something that made him suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd touched another person with anything approaching genuine connection. They moved toward the dance floor. Behind them, conversation stopped. Tad could feel eyes on his back, could sense the shift in the room's energy. He assumed people were surprised to see Earth's cultural liaison actually participating in something instead of standing near walls looking professionally concerned. I should probably mention that I'm not very good at this, Tad said, as they found a spot among the other dancers. The algorithmic music shifted, apparently detecting their intention and adjusting to accommodate. Fair warning, your feet are in moderate danger. She laughed, and the sound was surprisingly musical, like wind chimes made of crystal, with harmonics that seemed to vibrate at frequencies just outside normal hearing. Around them, several dancers adjusted their positions, creating more space. I think I can manage the risk, she said. Her eyes caught the light from the bioluminescent panels, and for a moment they seemed to flash with something that might have been amusement or might have been something far older. What's your name? Thaddeus Brennan, Tad for short. Earth's cultural liaison, which is a fancy way of saying I attend parties and try not to accidentally start wars by using the wrong fork. Have you started any wars yet? What intentionally, though there was an incident with a Venusian diplomat and some cheese that's still under investigation. Turns out offering dairy products to Venusians is somewhere between a social faux pas and a religious offense. Nobody mentioned this in my briefing. She smiled again, and Tad felt absurdly pleased that his terrible jokes were landing. They moved into the waltz, one of exactly 3 dances he could perform without causing injury. The music cooperated, settling into something with a steady 3/4 rhythm that even he couldn't mess up too badly. She was an extraordinary dancer. Every step perfectly placed, every turn executed with mathematical precision. It made him look even worse by comparison, which should have been embarrassing but somehow wasn't. She had a way of compensating for his limitations, making his stumbles look almost intentional, transforming his mediocre technique into something that almost resembled competence. You're really good at this, Tad observed as they completed a turn without incident. Makes me look even worse by comparison, so thanks for that. I've had practice. Something in her tone suggested she meant considerably more practice than a few lessons at a community center. Centuries of practice, maybe, but that was impossible. She looked maybe 30, 35 at most. Though with 17 different species in attendance, Tad had long since given up trying to estimate anyone's age based on appearance. So what brings you to Meridian Station? He asked as they transitioned into something that might have been a foxtrot, though the algorithmic music made it difficult to tell. Let me guess, you're here to sign a treaty that will reshape the political landscape of the outer colonies. Something like that. Her eyes glinted with what might have been amusement, though I find the actual politics considerably less interesting than the dancing. That's because politics is just theater for people who can't remember their lines. Tad narrowly avoided stepping on her foot as another couple swept past them, giving them an extraordinarily wide berth. The man actually pulled his partner closer as if proximity to Tad and his companion might be contagious. I mean, half of what we do here is just standing around pretending we understand what's happening while nodding seriously. It's all very important and very official, but also deeply absurd when you think about it. She tilted her head, and her long ears caught the light in a way that was oddly mesmerizing. You don't find your work fulfilling. Oh, I didn't say that. I love my job. I just think there's something fundamentally ridiculous about the fact that I'm supposed to prevent interstellar incidents by remembering whether the Titan delegation prefers their beverages room temperature or precisely 17 degrees Celsius. That's a lot of pressure to put on one guy who barely passed his psychological evaluation. You barely passed, um, technically I passed with flying colors. I just barely passed the psychological evaluation because apparently I have an irreverent attitude toward authority and a concerning tendency to make jokes during crisis simulations. Tad grinned, though there was something painful underneath it. In my defense, if you can't laugh when a fake alien invasion scenario goes wrong, you're taking life too seriously. She laughed again, that crystalline sound that seemed to make the air vibrate differently. Around them, more people were watching now. Their expressions ranged from curious to something that looked almost like fear. Tad noticed a group of officials from the outer worlds clustered near one of the support columns, whispering urgently, while their eyes remained fixed on the dance floor. Near the refreshment tables, Elliot had gone from pale to something approaching translucent, his face a mask of polite horror. "Does it bother you?" his partner asked. "Being watched." "Are we being watched? I thought everyone was just admiring my impeccable dance technique." Tad executed what he believed was a turn with only minimal stumbling. "Though now that you mention it, people have been acting weird. Maybe my reputation from the cheese incident has spread farther than I thought." The cheese incident sounds fascinating. It really wasn't. Turns out Venusian diplomats have a cultural prohibition against dairy products made from Earth animals, which no one mentioned to me before I offered the ambassador a sample of aged cheddar. He was very polite about his sudden need to evacuate the room, but I'm pretty sure I'm banned from their embassy now. The music shifted into something with a Latin rhythm. Tad felt a brief moment of panic before his partner smoothly adapted their movements, somehow making his flailing attempts at a tango look almost intentional. "You asked me to dance," she said as they moved through what might have been choreography if Tad had any idea what he was doing. "Why us Cesar?" "Why?" Tad blinked, momentarily thrown by the directness of the question. "Because you were standing over there looking like you wanted to and no one else had asked." Seemed like a waste for someone who's clearly an amazing dancer to spend the whole evening watching from the sidelines. Something shifted in her expression, a softness that made her seem somehow more real and less like a particularly beautiful hologram. "That's all. You didn't have any other reason." Should I have had another reason? Was I supposed to file the dance request form in triplicate? Because I definitely didn't do that, and now I'm worried I've committed some kind of protocol violation that's going to require an official apology. I'm very good at official apologies. I've had a lot of practice. "No forms required." Her voice was quiet, and in it Tad heard something he recognized. The sound of someone who'd stopped expecting kindness without strings attached. "I'm simply not used to people approaching without extensive planning." Planning for dancing, that seems like it would take all the fun out of it. Tad spun her, or rather she spun herself while making it look like he'd initiated it, and they came back together smoothly. Dancing should be spontaneous. Otherwise, it's just choreographed movement with extra steps, which I guess is technically what dancing is, but you know what I mean, Ben? I do," she said quietly, "more than you might think." The music transitioned again, mercifully settling into something slower that allowed for actual conversation without Tad having to divide his attention between talking and not causing a collision. His partner's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, cool through the fabric of his jacket. He was struck again by the elegance of her movements, the way she made even his clumsy attempts at dancing look almost graceful. "So," Tad said, realizing with some embarrassment that they'd been dancing for at least 20 minutes, and he'd never actually inquired, "What's your name?" "I've been calling you my dance partner in my head, which works but seems impersonal." She hesitated for the briefest moment. Something flickered across her face, uncertainty perhaps, or calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by that warm smile that made her seem less remote and more present. Valeria. Valeria, Tad tested the name, liking the way it felt in his mouth. That's beautiful. Is it from your home world? In a manner of speaking, it's quite old. Old names are the best names. They have history. Tad grinned, though there was an edge of self-deprecation to it. Unlike mine, which my parents picked because they thought Thaddeus sounded distinguished and professional, they were very concerned about my future employability even before I was born. Did it work? Well, I'm employed, so technically yes, though I'm not sure Thaddeus is what clinched the job. I think it was more my ability to smile while people yell at me about cheese. That's apparently a valuable diplomatic skill, remaining pleasant in the face of dairy-related international incidents. She laughed again, and this time Tad was certain he saw genuine delight in her expression. Not the polite acknowledgement that people gave to mediocre jokes at diplomatic functions, but real amusement. It made something warm unfurl in his chest, something he hadn't felt in too long. They'd moved through 4 dances, now maybe 5. The algorithmic music kept adapting, finding rhythms they could work with, and Tad found himself actually enjoying a diplomatic function for the first time in 18 months. Maybe for the first time in longer than that. The crowd around them had organized itself into a rough circle, maintaining that same careful distance. Tad finally registered what had been bothering him about their behavior. People weren't just giving them space to maneuver, they were actively avoiding proximity. A Martian delegate he vaguely recognized actually backed into a refreshment table while trying to increase the distance between them, sending several glasses of something luminescent crashing to the floor. Your friend seemed concerned, Valeria observed, nodding toward where Elliot stood near the entrance. His face had progressed beyond pale into a color that might generously be described as existential dread gray. Elliot always looks like that at parties. I think he finds the whole diplomatic scene stressful. Tad waved at his colleague, who did not wave back, but instead appeared to be experiencing some kind of medical emergency based on his expression. Though that's a particularly intense version of his usual anxiety face. Perhaps you should check on him. He's fine. If it were a real emergency, he'd signal me with our code. Tad and Elliot had developed a system for extracting each other from uncomfortable situations, though so far it had mostly involved Elliot rescuing Tad from conversations with people who wanted to discuss agricultural subsidies in extensive detail. The music swelled and they moved through another turn. Tad was actually starting to feel confident, which in his experience was usually right before something went catastrophically wrong. But Valeria was an excellent lead despite technically being in the follow position, and he found himself relaxing into the rhythm. I haven't enjoyed an evening this much in longer than I can remember, Valeria said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like genuine surprise. Thank you for asking me to dance, Thaddeus Brennan. Thank you for saying yes, and for not mentioning how many times I have almost stepped on your feet. I stopped counting after 12. That's generous. I'm pretty sure it's been at least 15. She smiled, and Tad felt absurdly proud of himself for making this intimidatingly elegant woman laugh. Whatever else happened tonight, he'd managed to give someone a good time at a diplomatic function. That felt like a genuine accomplishment, even if he still didn't understand why everyone was acting so strange about it. Elliot was definitely trying to get his attention, now making increasingly frantic gestures that Tad was determinedly ignoring. Whatever crisis his colleague thought was unfolding could wait until after this dance ended. The current piece concluded with a flourish that Tad only partially botched. They came to a natural stop, still holding their dance position, breathing slightly harder than normal. At least Tad was breathing harder. Valeria seemed completely unaffected, as if she could dance for hours without breaking a sweat. Perhaps we should take a break, she suggested. Catch our breath. Tad nodded, grateful. His feet were starting to protest the unaccustomed activity, and he could feel sweat beginning to form despite the station's aggressive climate control. They made their way toward the refreshment tables, where an array of beverages in various colors and viscosities waited in temperature-controlled containers. So the trick with these, Tad explained, gesturing at the drinks, is that approximately half of them will get you intoxicated. A quarter of them are just flavored water, and the remaining quarter will cause mild gastrointestinal distress if you're not from the right planet. It's like Russian roulette, but with more diplomatic incidents. Which do you recommend? The blue one is safe. It's from Earth, specifically designed to be inoffensive to the maximum number of species. It tastes like someone tried to make fruit punch but gave up halfway through and added disappointment instead. Valeria laughed and reached for one of the blue beverages. Her cool fingers brushed against his as she took the glass, and Tad noticed that several nearby delegates actually flinched at the contact. Okay, he thought, that's definitely weird. Even for diplomatic functions, that's weird. Before he could comment on the strange behavior, a figure appeared at Valeria's other side. The man was tall and severe, with skin as pale as Valeria's and similar pointed ears. He wore formal attire that looked like it cost more than Tad's annual salary, all black, with silver accents that caught the light. His face had the kind of harsh aristocratic beauty that suggested he'd never found anything amusing in several centuries of existence. Centuries. The word appeared in Tad's mind unbidden, and he suddenly wondered why he'd thought it. Your Majesty, the man said, his tone dripping with formality that somehow also conveyed criticism. Perhaps we should return to the designated area. This interaction has generated considerable attention. The words hit Tad like ice water. Your Majesty. His brain stuttered over the title, trying to process it. Your Majesty, as in royalty, as in someone so important that they had designated areas and formal protocols, and people who said Your Majesty with a kind of weight that suggested it wasn't just a title but a fundamental fact of existence. He looked at Valeria. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. Those dark eyes, he'd thought they were just dark, but now he realized they absorbed light in a way that wasn't quite natural. And the pale skin, the cool touch, the way people backed away, the extraordinary grace that came from centuries, not years of practice, Tad thought distantly. Oh no. Lord Cassius, Valeria said, her voice still warm but with an undercurrent of something that made the tall man take an involuntary step backward. Are you suggesting I should stop enjoying myself at a diplomatic celebration designed specifically for enjoyment? Not at all, Your Majesty. Simply that protocol dictates. Protocol dictates that I maintain appropriate dignity as a sovereign of the Sanguine territories. It does not, to my recollection, dictate whom I may or may not dance with. She turned back to Tad, and something in her expression was both apologetic and amused. Unless you've had enough of dancing with someone who apparently comes with complicated political implications. Sovereign of the Sanguine territories. The words rearranged themselves in Tad's mind, connecting to briefings he'd skimmed and forgotten, to warnings Elliot had tried to give him, to 18 months of diplomatic education that had clearly failed to prepare him for this exact moment. He'd just spent the last half hour dancing with vampire royalty. He'd asked one of the most powerful sovereigns in known space to dance like she was his neighbor, and she'd said yes. Tad stood frozen, the blue beverage forgotten in his hand. His mind was racing through the last 40 minutes, replaying every moment with new context. The cool touch of her hand, the way people had backed away, the extraordinary grace, the careful distance everyone maintained. Elliot's increasingly frantic signals. Your Majesty, sovereign of the Sanguine territories. He'd walked up to vampire royalty and asked her to dance like he was inviting someone to a neighborhood barbecue. Valeria was still watching him with that unreadable expression. Lord Cassius stood rigid beside her, radiating disapproval through every line of his formal attire. Around them, the ballroom had gone quieter. Conversations continued, but at lower volumes. People were watching without appearing to watch, that particular skill that diplomats mastered early in their careers. Tad started, then stopped. What did you say when you realized you just committed what was probably the most significant breach of diplomatic protocol in recent history? I should probably. Before he could finish the thought, a hand clamped around his arm with surprising strength. Excuse us, Elliot said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Mr. Brennan and I need to discuss something urgently. Tad found himself being physically pulled away from the refreshment table. Valeria watched this development with an expression of polite interest, sipping her disappointing blue beverage with perfect composure. Behind her, Lord Cassius's face remained carefully neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he was cataloging every detail of this interaction for future reference. What are you doing? Tad asked as Elliot dragged him behind a decorative plant that was probably from somewhere with very different concepts of what plants should look like. Its leaves were purple and seemed to be breathing. What am I doing? Elliot's whisper had progressed beyond urgent into something approaching hysteria. What are you doing? Do you have any idea who that is? I just found out, actually, about 30 seconds ago, when her friend called her Your Majesty. Tad tried to extract his arm from Elliot's grip without success, which was a bit of a surprise, I'll admit. A bit of a surprise. Elliot made a sound that might have been a laugh or possibly the beginning of a nervous breakdown. You walked up to Queen Valeria, one of the oldest and most powerful vampire sovereigns in known space, and asked her to dance like you were asking your neighbor to a barbecue. You said that already, about the barbecue. Because it's true, Tad. Do you understand what you just did? Tad looked at his colleague. Elliot's face had progressed through several shades of panic and was now approaching a color that didn't exist in normal human pigmentation. Behind them, the purple plant continued its unsettling breathing. I asked someone to dance, Tad said slowly. Someone who was standing alone and looked like she wanted to. That's what I did. Elliot struggled for words. That's not what you did. What you did was approach vampire royalty without clearance, without protocol, without any of the formal procedures that people spend months negotiating. People don't just walk up to Queen Valeria. Entire diplomatic teams plan their interactions in advance. There are security considerations, political implications. Dancing with a vampire queen carries enormous weight. It's a statement about alliances and power dynamics, and I thought she looked lonely, Tad interrupted. Elliot stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open. She was standing by the window, Tad continued quietly, watching people dance, and she looked lonely. That's what I saw. Not vampire royalty or political implications or whatever else you're worried about. Just someone who wanted to dance and nobody was asking her. Of course nobody was asking her. She's Queen Valeria. Her touch is considered dangerous. Nobody approaches her casually. The fact that you're still standing here suggests she found your ignorance amusing rather than insulting, which is, Elliot paused, his face cycling through several more shades of panic. Actually, I don't know if that's better or worse. Tad turned to look back at the refreshment table. Valeria was still standing there, now engaged in quiet conversation with Lord Cassius. Her posture had shifted subtly. No longer the relaxed stance of someone enjoying a party, but something more careful, more controlled. The posture of someone who could move with devastating speed if required. As if sensing his attention, she looked up and met his eyes across the distance. Her smile was knowing, edged with amusement, and in that moment, Tad understood with sudden clarity that she knew exactly what Elliot was telling him. She'd known from the moment he'd approached her what a massive breach of protocol his casual invitation represented, and she'd accepted it anyway. She's laughing at me, Tad said, though there was no malice in the observation. She thinks my horrified realization is funny. Of course she's laughing at you. You probably gave her the most entertainment she's had in decades. Elliot was gripping Tad's shoulders now, as if physical contact might somehow transfer understanding more effectively. Do you know what happens when someone asks a vampire queen to dance? It gets analyzed by political experts. Treaties have been written about less significant interactions. The delegation from New Saturn once spent 3 months preparing a formal request for an audience, and you just walked up and said, "Would you like to dance?" like you were asking for directions to the bathroom. In my defense, I genuinely didn't know. That's not a defense, that's the problem. Elliot took a breath, clearly trying to compose himself. Okay, what's done is done. You've danced with vampire royalty multiple times in front of everyone. This is going to be analyzed and discussed and probably written about in diplomatic journals. The question now is what you do next. Tad considered this. He could feel the weight of the ballroom's attention even from behind the breathing purple plant. People were watching without appearing to watch, waiting to see what Earth's cultural liaison would do now that he understood the magnitude of his mistake. Mistake. Was it a mistake? He thought about the last 40 minutes. About Valeria's laugh, genuine and surprised. About the way her expression had softened when he asked her to dance. About that look of longing she'd worn while watching others enjoy themselves. About how for a brief time she'd seemed less like untouchable royalty and more like someone who just wanted simple human connection. Or vampire connection, as it turned out. I'm going back, Tad said. Elliot's face went through several rapid expressions before settling on something between horror and resignation. You're what? I'm going back over there. I'm going to continue our conversation. Tad gently removed Elliot's hands from his shoulders. She accepted my invitation. She's been kind and funny and seems to be genuinely enjoying herself. So I'm going to go back over there and continue treating her like someone I asked to dance because apparently that's the only approach that's worked so far. That's insane. Probably. Tad straightened his gray jacket, which had gotten rumpled during Elliot's panic attack. But insanity seems to be my specialty. If I don't come back, please make sure my apartment plants get watered. They're probably dead already, but it's the thought that counts. He could feel Elliot's horrified stare boring into his back as he crossed the ballroom. Other guests parted before him, their expressions mixing fascination with concern. Some looked impressed. Others looked like they were watching a man walk to his execution with admirable dignity. The two figures who'd been speaking with Valeria Lord Cassius and another vampire courtier, a woman with silver white hair, stepped back as he approached. Their faces remained carefully neutral, but their body language screamed disapproval with every precisely controlled movement. Valeria watched him return. Her dark eyes caught the light from the bioluminescent panels, and Tad could see amusement there, mixed with something that might have been respect, or might have been the vampire equivalent of deciding not to eat the entertaining pet. So, Tad said, picking up his own disappointing blue beverage from where he'd set it down, apparently you're royalty, which explains why Elliot looked like he was having a medical emergency. I feel like that's the sort of thing that might have come up during our conversation about my cheese-related diplomatic failures. Valeria's laugh was different this time. Less controlled, more genuine. The sound rippled through the air like music played on instruments that didn't quite exist in normal space. You knew I was enjoying watching your face when the realization hit. That was uncharitable of me. I've had worse things done to me in the name of entertainment. Tad took a sip of his beverage and immediately regretted it. The disappointment had somehow intensified. Though I have to say, finding out I've been casually dancing with vampire royalty does rank pretty high on my list of situations I was completely unprepared for despite extensive training. Your training didn't cover accidentally dancing with ancient sovereigns. There was a module on it, but I was sick that day, food poisoning from the cafeteria's attempt at pasta. Tad set down his drink with finality. So should I be apologizing? Elliot made it sound like I'd committed some kind of catastrophic breach of protocol that might result in diplomatic consequences and possibly my untimely death. Valeria's expression softened. She reached out and touched his arm lightly, the same cool contact he'd felt during their dances. Even knowing what she was, vampire queen being old enough to remember things humans had forgotten, the coolness of her hands still felt oddly comfortable. Do you want to know something? Her voice was quiet, meant only for him despite the many ears listening. When you walked up to me and asked if I'd like to dance, do you know what I thought? That I was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I thought, here is someone who doesn't know who I am. She withdrew her hand but held his gaze. Those dark eyes were deeper than he'd realized, holding depths that might have been centuries or might have been something more fundamental. Do you understand how rare that is? Everyone who approaches me knows exactly who I am. Every word they speak is calculated. Every gesture is weighted with implications about alliances or demonstrations of courage or requests for favor. When someone asks me to dance, it's never simple. It's a political statement that will be analyzed by experts and discussed in council chambers. That sounds exhausting. It is. Something vulnerable flickered across her face, quickly controlled, but not quite hidden. But you asked me to dance because I looked like I wanted to. No calculation, no agenda. No attempt to prove your bravery or secure advantage. For 40 minutes, I got to be simply someone who enjoyed dancing with someone who thought I might want to dance. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer still. That's more precious than you can possibly understand. Tad felt his embarrassment fading, replaced by something warmer. Something that hurt in a good way, like muscles being used after too long dormant. Well, when you put it that way, I feel less like an idiot and more like I accidentally did something right for completely wrong reasons. I believe the best things often happen for the wrong reasons. That's either very profound or you're making fun of me again. I honestly can't tell. Valeria smiled, and for a moment she looked younger than her 347 years. Or maybe she looked exactly her age, and Tad was just now seeing past the careful mask she wore for the rest of the world. Perhaps both, she said. Behind them, Lord Cassius cleared his throat with the kind of precise sound that suggested centuries of experience in diplomatic interruption. Your Majesty, if I might have a word. Later, Cassius. Valeria didn't look away from Tad. I'm having a conversation. The courtier's face remained impassive, but something in his posture suggested he was filing this interaction away for future reference, possibly under unprecedented situations requiring careful analysis, or possibly under things Her Majesty does that will give me gray hair, despite being physiologically impossible. Perhaps, Valeria said, turning back to Tad with that same amused expression, we should continue our dance. Unless you've decided that knowing who I am changes things too much. Tad considered this. He could feel the weight of the ballroom watching them. Elliot near the entrance, pale and panicking. Lord Cassius and the silver-haired courtier radiating controlled disapproval. Delegates from 17 worlds analyzing every word, every gesture, every subtle implication of what was happening. He thought about Valeria's expression when he'd first asked her to dance. The surprise, the delight, the way she looked at him like he'd given her something she'd forgotten existed. I mean, Tad said, offering his hand, I was planning to spend this evening standing near walls and looking professionally concerned. But dancing with vampire royalty while various officials have small panic attacks sounds more interesting. So if you're willing to risk further damage to protocol, I'm in. Valeria's smile was brilliant. She took his hand, and the cool touch felt familiar now, comfortable in a way that defied the strangeness of everything else about the situation. I believe one more dance wouldn't hurt. Lord Cassius made a sound that might have been a sigh or possibly the vampire equivalent of suppressed rage. But he stepped aside, and the silver-haired courtier actually smiled faintly before following her colleague back to whatever constituted the vampire delegation's official position in the ballroom. As they moved back toward the dance floor, Tad noticed the crowd's reaction had evolved from shock into something more complex. Some faces showed disapproval, others showed fascination, and a few mostly younger delegates from various worlds showed something that looked almost like approval. A human official he vaguely recognized was frantically speaking into a communications device, probably trying to figure out if this development required immediate intervention from someone more important. But before they could reach the dance floor, Lord Cassius stepped forward again. His timing was impeccable, placing himself directly in their path. His voice carried just enough to be heard by nearby delegates, though whether this was intentional or simply the acoustics of the ballroom, Tad couldn't tell. Your Majesty, perhaps we should withdraw and address the concerns that several delegations have raised. Valeria stopped. For a moment, Tad thought she might acquiesce, might allow herself to be pulled back into the careful choreography of diplomatic protocol. But then something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like defiance. She turned to face not just Lord Cassius, but the watching crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of 3 centuries, but also something new, something that sounded like joy mixed with determination. Lord Cassius, I appreciate your counsel. I appreciate the concerns of the various delegations, and I appreciate that you all have my best interests at heart. She paused, and in that pause, Tad could feel the entire ballroom holding its breath. But tonight I choose to finish this dance. The concerns can wait until morning. Queens are allowed to dance, are they not? The silence that followed was profound. A ripple moved through the ballroom. Shock, certainly. Calculation as delegates tried to determine what this meant politically. But also, and this surprised Tad, approval. From some quarters, at least. Younger delegates exchanged glances that suggested they were witnessing something unprecedented. A few of the vampire representatives from neutral territories nodded subtly, as if acknowledging something they hadn't expected to see. Lord Cassius's expression went through several subtle shifts. Disapproval gave way to something more complex, concern mixed with what might have been understanding. After a long moment that felt like an eternity, he bowed. As your Majesty wishes. As he withdrew, Tad caught the briefest flash of something in the courtier's eyes. Not anger, not even disapproval anymore. Something that looked almost like pride. Valeria turned back to Tad, and her expression had transformed completely. The careful control was still there, but underneath it was something bright and fierce. Something that suggested she'd just made a choice that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "Shall we?" she asked. The music shifted into something slower, more intimate. One of the rare pieces where the algorithmic composition had actually managed to capture something approaching genuine emotion. Tad found himself once again dancing with a woman who he now knew could probably break him in half without much effort, but who instead was choosing to laugh at his jokes and pretend he wasn't completely out of his depth. "So what happens after this?" Tad asked as they settled into the rhythm. "Do I need to fill out forms, make official statements, sign something promising not to accidentally dance with any more vampire queens? After this, I will make it clear to my people and to the other delegations that your invitation was not presumption." Her voice was thoughtful, like she was working through the political implications even as they danced. It was recognition that even queens who rule territories and command respect across known space might occasionally want to dance without the weight of centuries pressing down on every step. That's a much nicer way of saying I had no idea what I was doing, but it worked out. Sometimes the best diplomacy comes from people who don't realize they're being diplomatic. They moved through the dance, and Tad was aware of the many calculations happening around them. Other officials positioning themselves strategically, probably preparing to either take credit for or distance themselves from whatever this represented in the complex algebra of interstellar relations. "I should probably tell you," Valeria said as they completed another turn, "that by accepting your invitation and dancing with you multiple times, I've essentially made a statement about Earth's diplomatic standing in relation to the Sanguine territories. Various officials will spend the next several weeks trying to determine exactly what that statement means. Is it a good statement or a 'we're going to have problems' statement? It's a vampire queens appreciate genuine kindness over calculated politics statement, which is, I think, the best kind." Valeria had forgotten what it felt like to simply enjoy a moment without analyzing it. 347 years of existence had taught her to see 7 moves ahead in any interaction, to calculate angles and implications, to understand that every word carried weight, every gesture had consequence. She'd become very good at it, so good that she'd forgotten what it was like to just experience something without measuring its political value. But here dancing with this utterly unprepared human diplomat who had somehow stumbled into treating her like a person instead of a position, she found herself just enjoying it. His technique was terrible. He'd stepped on her foot at least 20 times, though she'd compensated so smoothly he probably hadn't noticed. His jokes were self-deprecating, to the point of concerning, suggesting someone who'd learned to deflect attention through humor. And he had absolutely no understanding of the massive statement he was making simply by continuing to treat her normally after learning who she was, all of which made him completely charming. "You're thinking," Tad observed. "I can see it in your face. Probably calculating how much damage control you'll need to do after this." "Actually, I was thinking that this is the first time in a very long time that I've enjoyed a diplomatic function. Really, because this is the first time I've actively participated in one instead of hiding behind decorative plants." Valeria laughed. Lord Cassius, watching from the edge of the dance floor, would be cataloging every one of these laughs, measuring their frequency, their genuineness, their potential political implications. She'd have to explain to him later that sometimes a laugh was just a laugh, not a statement of alliance or a sign of compromised judgment, though in this case it might actually be both. "May I ask you something personal?" Valeria said. "You can ask. I might not answer, but that's better than not asking at all. Earlier you mentioned losing someone important. You didn't say who." Tad's expression shifted. Not closed exactly, but more careful, like he was deciding how much truth to share. "My wife, Elizabeth, 2 years ago." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment, their dance continuing on automatic rhythm. "Cancer. The kind that doesn't care how much you love someone or how hard you fight. It just takes what it wants and leaves you standing there, wondering what you're supposed to do with all the leftover love that has nowhere to go." Valeria felt something catch in her chest. An old pain, carefully buried, suddenly pressing against centuries of carefully maintained distance. "After she died," Tad continued, his voice softer now, "I couldn't stay in our apartment, couldn't work at the same job. Couldn't be in any of the places where we'd been happy together because the happiness had become evidence of what I'd lost. So I applied for this position, cultural liaison to anywhere that wasn't home. 18 months of standing at diplomatic functions, pretending to be professionally concerned, going through all the motions of living without actually feeling alive. He looked at her, and something in his eyes was older than 37 years should be. The kind of age that came from grief, not time. Until tonight, he said, when I saw someone standing alone who looked like she needed the same thing I needed. To be asked, to be seen, to remember just for a little while what it feels like to connect with another person without walls between you. Valeria's breath caught an unnecessary reflex since she didn't technically need to breathe, but one she maintained out of habit and something deeper than habit. That's exactly what it was like. What it is like. You've lost someone too. It wasn't a question, but Valeria nodded anyway. A long time ago, long enough that I've forgotten what his favorite season was or what he sounded like when he was angry. But I remember how it felt to be with him, to be seen as Valeria first and Queen second, to dance without every movement being analyzed for political significance. What was his name? Jonathan. The name felt strange on her tongue after 2 centuries. She'd avoided saying it for so long, as if not speaking his name might somehow lessen the ache. He was human, a diplomat actually, not unlike yourself, kind, sincere, utterly unprepared for the complexities of vampire politics. And I loved him for exactly those qualities. What happened? What always happens when queens make choices based on heart instead of strategy. Politics intervened. He died and she paused, choosing her words carefully. I built walls, very tall, very strong walls. And I told myself those walls were protection, that staying distant was staying safe. Were you safe? Yes, and utterly, completely alone. The music swelled around them, and Valeria realized they'd been dancing for over an hour now. The longest she'd spent with anyone outside formal council business in 2 centuries. And yet it felt like no time at all. Like she could dance with this grieving human diplomat for hours more and still find new things to talk about, new ways to laugh, new moments of connection that didn't require centuries of careful negotiation. Your courtiers are getting concerned, Tad observed. Lord Cassius looks like he's aged several years in the last hour, which I assume is impressive for vampires. Cassius worries professionally, it's what he does. But Valeria glanced toward her senior courtier and saw the tension in his posture. Not anger, she realized, concern. He'd watched her close herself off after Jonathan's death, had stood beside her through 200 years of carefully maintained distance. Now he was watching her open herself up again, and he was terrified she'd be hurt. The realization softened something in her. They're not trying to control me. They're trying to protect me. From what me, Tad smiled. I'm arguably the least threatening person in this room. I can't even protect cheese from Venusian diplomats. From myself, from choosing vulnerability over safety, from risking the kind of pain that comes when you let someone matter. Is that what you're doing? Letting me matter? Valeria met his eyes. I think perhaps I am, which is either very brave or very foolish. In my experience, those are usually the same thing. As the current dance wound down, a figure approached from the vampire delegation. Not Lord Cassius this time, but the silver-haired courtier who'd smiled earlier. She stopped at a respectful distance, waiting for acknowledgement. Valeria nodded. Lady Moraine. The ancient vampire Valeria knew her to be nearly 600 years old. One of the oldest among the sanguine representatives stepped forward. Her pale eyes held something that looked almost like approval. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but I wish to say... Lady Moraine paused and something softened in her severe features. It's good to see you happy again. Jonathan would have approved. The words hit Valeria like a physical impact. Lady Moraine had known Jonathan, had been one of the few vampire courtiers who hadn't opposed their relationship, who'd grieved alongside Valeria when he died. Thank you, Moraine, Valeria said quietly. The elder vampire inclined her head, then turned to Tad. And you, young diplomat, you've done something remarkable tonight. Not everyone has the courage to see people instead of positions. Before Tad could respond, she withdrew, returning to the vampire delegation with the same graceful silence that had brought her. Well, Tad said after a moment, that was unexpected. Moraine lost someone too, a long time ago, she understands. They stood there in the relative quiet of the dance floor's edge, the music transitioning into something new. Around them, the gala was beginning its gradual wind down. Some delegates were already making their departures complete with all the formal farewells that such functions required. The evening was ending. Soon they'd return to their separate worlds, Valeria to her flagship, and the weight of ruling the sanguine territories, Tad to his small quarters on Meridian Station, and the mundane duties of Earth's cultural liaison. But before that happened, before protocol and position reasserted themselves completely, Valeria wanted one more thing. Thaddeus, she said, using his full name for the first time. Next time there's a diplomatic gathering, perhaps you'll ask me to dance again. Now that you know who I am. Tad was quiet for a moment. Then that self-deprecating smile crossed his face, the one that suggested humor masking something deeper. Will it cause massive political complications? Almost certainly. There will be analysis and discussion. Various factions will try to determine what it means. Some will approve, others will object. It will be complicated in ways that neither of us can fully predict. Then I'll definitely ask. Valeria felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 200 years. Not just gratitude or amusement, but genuine hope. The possibility that perhaps despite everything, despite centuries and mortality, despite politics and positions, perhaps there could be more moments like this. I'll look forward to it, she said. As if on cue, Lord Cassius appeared at her elbow. His timing was impeccable, suggesting he had been waiting for a natural pause in their conversation. Your Majesty, our ship departs in 30 minutes. If you wish to make your farewells. Of course, Cassius. Valeria turned back to Tad one final time. Thank you for this evening, Mr. Brennan, for reminding me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply ask someone to dance. Thank you for saying yes, Your Majesty, and for not having me thrown out an airlock when you realized I had no idea what I was doing. She laughed one more time, that crystalline sound that seemed to make the air vibrate with frequencies just outside normal hearing. Then with visible reluctance, she stepped back. The transformation was immediate. Queen Valeria reasserted herself, the ancient sovereign whose presence commanded careful distance, whose every action carried the weight of 3 centuries of rule. Her courtiers materialized at her sides, forming the protective formation she'd grown so accustomed to. But as she turned to make her formal farewells to the other dignitaries, she glanced back at Tad. And in that glance was everything they hadn't said, everything they were beginning to feel. Everything that was becoming possible despite all the practical reasons why it shouldn't be. Tad watched her leave a small smile on his face that suggested he understood exactly what that glance meant. Elliot appeared at his elbow, looking like he'd aged several years in one evening. You know this is going to be complicated, right? Extremely. And you're okay with it, Tad thought about the last 2 years, about going through motions without feeling alive, about standing at diplomatic functions professionally concerned but personally absent, about all the ways grief had taught him to protect himself from further pain by refusing to feel anything at all. And he thought about Valeria's laugh, about the way her expression softened when she was asked instead of approached, about how she'd spent 2 centuries building walls that kept her safe but utterly completely alone. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm okay with that. Morning came to Meridian Station in the form of programmed lighting that gradually brightened through the viewports, mimicking sunrise for species that needed circadian rhythms. Valeria stood in the observation room of her flagship, watching the station's slow rotation bring Earth into view. The planet hung there like a jewel against darkness, blue and white and impossibly fragile looking, despite hosting billions of souls. She hadn't slept. Vampires didn't need sleep the way humans did, though she'd learned over centuries that something resembling rest made existence more bearable. But last night she'd stood at her window through all the manufactured hours, replaying conversations and dances, feeling things she'd carefully avoided feeling for 200 years. Behind her, she heard the careful footsteps that announced Lord Cassius's arrival. He waited in silence, respecting the moment before speaking. Your Majesty, the delegations are assembled. Valeria turned from the viewport. Her senior courtier looked tired, though, whether from actual fatigue or simply the weight of concern, she couldn't tell. How many? 5 vampire representatives, all from neutral or allied territories. No one from the opposition factions, interestingly enough. They're waiting to see which way the wind blows before committing to a position. As always. Lord Cassius's expression was neutral, but she'd known him long enough to read the tension in his shoulders. Your Majesty, if I may speak frankly, when have I ever stopped you? Last night was unprecedented. The other delegations are uncertain how to interpret your actions. Some see it as a diplomatic overture to Earth. Others believe it was a personal choice that should not be analyzed politically. A few wonder if you were temporarily influenced by some unknown factor. You mean they wonder if I've lost my judgment? They wonder if you are well, Your Majesty. His voice softened. As do I. Valeria studied her courtier, 400 years old. He'd served her for over a century, stood beside her through treaties and conflicts, watched her close herself off after Jonathan's death. He'd never questioned her decisions, never pushed her to explain herself. But now she saw genuine concern in his ancient eyes. I'm more well than I've been in 2 centuries, Cassius. That's what concerns everyone, isn't it? That I might actually be feeling something again. Your Majesty, it's all right, I understand. You all watched me grieve. You watched me build walls and tell myself they were strength. And now you're watching me question those walls, and you're terrified I'll be hurt again. She crossed to where he stood, placing a hand on his arm. But Cassius, I've been safe for 200 years. Safe and completely, utterly alone. Last night reminded me that safety isn't living. It's just existing. Before he could respond, she moved past him toward the council chamber. Let's not keep them waiting. The council chamber on Valeria's flagship was designed for intimidation. High ceilings that disappeared into shadow. A circular table of black stone that seemed to absorb light. Chairs positioned with mathematical precision to ensure every participant could see every other participant's face. Valeria had commissioned it 3 centuries ago, back when she'd believed that power was best displayed through overwhelming presence. Now she wondered if she'd simply been compensating for feeling small. 5 vampire representatives stood as she entered. Not her direct courtiers, but emissaries from other territories within the Sanguine Alliance. All ancient, all powerful in their own domains. All watching her with expressions that ranged from curious to concerned. Your Majesty, the speaker was Lady Moraine, the same courtier who'd approached her last night. Nearly 600 years old, silver hair framing a face that had seen empires rise and fall. Thank you for meeting with us. Lady Moraine, honored delegates. Valeria took her seat at the head of the table and the others followed suit. I understand my actions last night have generated discussion. Discussion. Lord Varen, a vampire from the outer territories, leaned forward. His dark eyes held something between concern and calculation. Your Majesty, you danced with an unknown human diplomat for over an hour. No protocols, no security clearance, no advanced negotiation. The other species delegations are trying to determine what political statement you were making. I was making no political statement. Silence greeted this pronouncement. Then, forgive me, Your Majesty, but what were you doing? This from Ambassador Thane, whose territory bordered human space. His expression suggested genuine confusion rather than criticism. We've received inquiries from 17 different delegations trying to understand the implications of your actions. Valeria looked at each of them in turn. Ancient beings, all of them. Powerful, careful, calculating every move in the endless chess game of interstellar politics. She'd been one of them for so long, she'd forgotten there was any other way to exist. I was dancing, she said quietly, with someone who asked kindly, someone who didn't know who I was and therefore treated me like a person instead of a position. And for the first time in 200 years, I felt alive instead of just functionally immortal. Lady Moraine's expression shifted. Something that might have been understanding flickered across her ancient face. Your Majesty, we're not here to criticize. We're here because we're concerned. Concerned that I might have compromised our security. Concerned that you might be hurt. This came from Lord Cassius, who'd taken his position at the table. Your Majesty, we all remember Jonathan. We watched you grieve. We watched you close yourself off, and while we regretted the loss of your joy, we understood it. You were protecting yourself from pain that could destroy even the strongest among us. And now, Lady Moraine continued, her voice gentle, in a way that suggested she understood more than she was saying, you have opened yourself to someone again, a human no less, someone who will age and die in what is for us barely a moment. We fear you're setting yourself up for the same grief you experienced 2 centuries ago." Valeria was quiet for a long moment. Outside the viewport, Meridian Station continued its slow rotation, bringing distant stars into view one by one. "You're right," she said finally. "You're absolutely right. If I pursue any kind of connection with Thaddeus Brennan, I will likely watch him age and die. I will grieve again. The pain will be just as devastating as it was with Jonathan, perhaps more so, because this time I'll see it coming." She stood moving to the viewport to look out at the stars. "But do you know what I realized last night? I've spent 200 years protecting myself from grief. And in doing so, I've protected myself from everything else as well. From yuck, from connection, from the simple pleasure of laughing with someone who makes terrible jokes about cheese." She turned back to face them. "I've been queen for 347 years. I've negotiated treaties that reshape territorial boundaries. I've prevented wars and brokered peace. I've done everything a sovereign should do. But I haven't lived, not really. Not since Jonathan died, and I decided that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything." "Your Majesty," Lord Varen started. "No." Valeria's voice carried the authority of 3 centuries, but underneath it was something else. Something vulnerable and fierce at once. "I've listened to wisdom and caution for 200 years. I've been careful and strategic and utterly, completely empty inside. Last night, a grieving human diplomat asked me to dance because I looked lonely. He didn't know who I was. He didn't want anything from me except the pleasure of company. And for one evening, I remembered what it felt like to be Valeria. Just Valeria." She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward. "I won't apologize for that. I won't apologize for choosing to feel alive again, even if it means risking pain. Even if it means watching someone I care about fade while I remain unchanged. Because the alternative existing in safety, but never truly living, that's not protection. That's just a different kind of death." The silence that followed was profound. Lady Moraine was the first to speak. Her voice, when it came, was softer than Valeria had ever heard it. "Your Majesty, 2 centuries ago I lost someone. A human diplomat, actually. Much like your Jonathan, like this Thaddeus Brennan. He was kind and funny and utterly unprepared for the complexities of vampire politics. And when he died, I told myself I would never allow myself such vulnerability again." She looked at Valeria with eyes that had seen 5 centuries of joy and grief. "I've kept that promise for 300 years. And do you know what I've learned? That safety is overrated. That the years I spent with him, brief as they were worth more than the centuries I've spent protecting myself from similar joy." "You're saying I should pursue this connection?" Valeria asked. "I'm saying you should live, Your Majesty, however that looks for you. We will support you. We will protect you as best we can. But we won't cage you anymore." Lord Varen cleared his throat. "The human diplomat, Brennan, our intelligence suggests he's genuine. His diplomatic failures are exactly what they appear to be: honest mistakes from someone who cares more about people than protocols. If you choose to see where this leads, we will not oppose it. Though we reserve the right to worry," Lord Cassius added, "professionally." Valeria felt something loosen in her chest. A tension she'd been carrying for so long, she'd forgotten it was there. They weren't trying to control her. They were trying to protect her. And now they were choosing to step back and let her choose vulnerability over safety. "Thank you," she said quietly. "All of you." "Your Majesty," Ambassador Thane spoke up. "What do you wish us to tell the other delegations? They're still trying to understand the political implications of last night." Valeria considered this, the political implications. The statements and counterstatements, the endless analysis of every gesture and word, the same game she'd been playing for 3 centuries. "Tell them," she said slowly, "that Queen Valeria of the Sanguine Territories danced with a kind human who asked her kindly. Tell them it was not a political statement, but a personal choice. And tell them that sometimes even queens need to remember their people first and positions second." Lady Moraine smiled. "That will cause quite a stir." "Good. We could all use a little stirring. We've been stagnant for too long." Tad sat in the small office assigned to Earth's cultural liaison, staring at the message on his datapad. He'd read it 3 times now, and it still didn't make any more sense. "Request for your presence at 0900 hours. Senior Diplomatic Corps, Priority 1. Priority 1 messages were usually reserved for crises, wars starting, treaties collapsing, ambassadors accidentally insulting each other into diplomatic incidents that required months to resolve, or apparently for cultural liaisons who dance with vampire queens. You look like you're reading your own execution order. Elliot appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, real coffee imported from Earth at ridiculous expense, which meant this was either a peace offering or a last meal. I'm trying to decide if I should pack my things now or wait to see if they let me keep them. They're not going to fire you. Elliot handed him one of the cups. Probably. The diplomatic corps has been in meetings all night trying to figure out what happened and what it means. What it means is that I'm an idiot who can't read briefing packets and accidentally committed a massive breach of protocol. Or, Elliot sat down across from him. What it means is that you did something unprecedented that might actually be beneficial for Earth's diplomatic standing. The vampire delegations haven't issued any formal complaints. In fact, Queen Valeria's people released a statement this morning saying the interaction was welcomed and demonstrated Earth's capacity for genuine connection over calculated politics. Tad blinked. They said that, almost word for word, they're calling you a model of sincere diplomacy. Elliot smiled, which is hilarious given that your sincerity came from complete ignorance. I prefer to think of it as authentic engagement unburdened by preconceptions. That's what I just said, but with more words. Tad took a sip of Mophie, letting the warmth settle his nerves. So I'm not getting fired. I don't think so, but the senior corps does want to talk to you, probably to figure out if your approach was genius or just incredibly lucky. Elliot paused. For what it's worth, I think you did good. Not the way I would have done it. Not the way anyone would have done it. But watching you last night, watching you just treat her like a person instead of a political entity, it was weirdly inspiring. Weirdly inspiring. That should be on my performance review. It probably will be. The Senior Diplomatic Corps office was intimidating in the way that important places tried to be. Expensive furniture, artwork from 17 different worlds, a window that looked out onto Meridian Station's main hub, where ships came and went in carefully orchestrated patterns. Director Morrison sat behind a desk that looked carved from a single piece of alien wood. She was 50-something, with gray-streaked hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen everything and was only mildly surprised by most of it. Sharp blue eyes studied Tad as he entered, assessing him in the way that people with real authority could make you feel simultaneously seen and judged. Mr. Brennan, sit. Tad sat. You've had an interesting evening. That's one way to describe it, ma'am. Would you like to tell me what happened in your own words? Not the official report Mr. Graves filed, which makes you sound like either a diplomatic savant or someone with a severe head injury. Tad took a breath. I saw someone standing alone who looked like she wanted to dance. So I asked her. I didn't know who she was. When I found out, I decided to continue treating her the same way because she seemed to be enjoying herself, and it felt like the right thing to do. Director Morrison studied him. The right thing to do, despite massive breach of protocol, despite potential political complications, despite the fact that you were dancing with one of the most powerful beings in known space. Yes, ma'am. That's either very brave or very stupid. I've been told they're usually the same thing. Something that might have been a smile flickered across the director's face. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to tell you something that doesn't leave this office. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. The cheese incident, the one with the Venusian ambassador. Do you remember it? I tried to forget it, but yes. Ambassador Thorne, the Venusian you offended, sent me a message this morning. He wanted me to know that the cheese incident wasn't entirely your fault. In a sense, he was testing you. Tad blinked. Testing me? Not in the elaborate way you're probably imagining. He simply wanted to see how you'd handle a genuine mistake. Whether you'd deflect blame, make excuses, or take responsibility with grace. You did the latter. You apologized sincerely without defensiveness and moved forward without letting the failure define you. I didn't know that. That was the point. Thorne has been observing you for 18 months. How you handle yourself at functions. How you treat people regardless of their position. How you find humor in difficult situations without using it to avoid genuine connection. Director Morrison leaned forward. He recommended you for a special assignment, one that we've been trying to fill for 2 years. What assignment? Primary liaison to the Sanguine Territories, based partly on Earth, partly on Meridian Station, partly on vampire flagships. You'd be working directly with Queen Valeria's council, facilitating communication and cooperation between human and vampire interests. Tad's mind went blank. You want me to work with Queen Valeria? Yes. It's a prestigious position, difficult, politically sensitive. It requires someone who can navigate vampire protocols while maintaining genuine human connection. She paused. Someone who can see people instead of positions. Someone who would ask a lonely queen to dance without calculating the political implications. Ma'am, I asked her to dance because I didn't know who she was. And that's exactly why you're perfect for this role. You don't approach interactions as transactions. You approach them as human connections. That's rare in diplomatic circles. It's also exactly what this position needs. Tad sat back, his coffee forgotten. If I accept this, I'd be seeing her regularly. Queen Valeria. Yes, is that a problem? He thought about last night, about Valeria's laugh, about the way she'd looked when he'd asked her to dance, surprised and delighted and suddenly less alone, about her admission that she'd been protecting herself from feeling for 200 years, about his own 2 years of going through motions without feeling alive. No, ma'am, it's not a problem. Then you accept. Tad thought about Elizabeth, about what she'd say if she could see him now. She'd probably laugh at the absurdity of it all, her husband who could barely remember to take out the trash being offered a position working with a vampire royalty. But underneath the laughter, she'd be proud. She'd tell him to take the chance, to choose living over existing in safety. Yes, ma'am, I accept. 1 week later, Meridian Station hosted another diplomatic gathering, smaller than the previous gala but no less important. A reception celebrating renewed cooperation agreements between several territories with representatives from all the major powers in attendance. Tad arrived early wearing a new suit that Elliot had insisted upon, charcoal gray with subtle blue threading that managed to look both professional and approachable. Primary liaisons to vampire territories need to look the part, Elliot had said while adjusting Tad's collar for the third time. The ballroom was less crowded tonight, maybe 200 delegates instead of 500. The same algorithmic music played, the same bioluminescent panels shifted through diplomatic colors. But something felt different. Or maybe Tad felt different knowing what he knew now about protocols and positions and the weight that came with choosing to connect despite complications. He spotted Valeria immediately. She stood near the same observation window where he'd first seen her, though tonight she wasn't alone. Lord Cassius stood nearby, along with Lady Moraine and several other vampire courtiers. They were engaged in what looked like serious conversation with delegates from the Centauri colonies, discussing something that involved careful gestures and diplomatic nods. But then Valeria's eyes found his across the room. Her expression remained diplomatically neutral, but something in those dark eyes caught the light. Recognition, warmth, and something else that looked like anticipation mixed with hope. The evening progressed through the usual patterns, conversations about trade and territories, carefully worded discussions about cooperation and boundaries. Tad found himself moving through it all with more confidence than before, understanding now that every interaction carried weight, but that weight didn't have to crush spontaneity. Finally, the formal proceedings concluded and the gathering shifted into its social phase. Music played. People began to relax fractionally, and the receiving line formed where delegates could formally greet the evening's hosts. Tad joined the line, waiting his turn. When he reached Valeria, he bowed with the precise angle Elliot had drilled into him, 30 degrees for vampire royalty hold, for 2 seconds, rise smoothly. Your Majesty, it's an honor to serve as primary liaison to the Sanguine Territories. I look forward to our collaboration. Mr. Brennan, her voice was warm beneath the formal words pitched for his ears, despite the many listening. I'm pleased Earth has appointed someone with your particular talents to this position. I believe we'll accomplish much together. The words were standard diplomatic exchange, but then she added quietly enough that only he could hear. I understand there's a function scheduled for next month. I wonder if you might have thoughts on appropriate protocols for such gatherings. Tad kept his expression professionally neutral, though he could feel the corners of his mouth threatening to curve upward. I'd be happy to discuss protocols, Your Majesty, though I should warn you my track record with following them is questionable at best. Sometimes the most effective protocols are the ones we create ourselves rather than inherit. That sounds dangerously close to encouraging improvisation, Your Majesty. Perhaps I am. Others were waiting behind him, so Tad moved on with a final respectful bow. But as he did, he caught Lady Moraine watching them with an expression that looked almost like approval. And Lord Cassius, standing at Valeria's other side, had what might have been the ghost of a smile on his usually severe face. The evening progressed. Tad made conversation with various delegates, finding it easier now that he understood his role, not just as observer, but as bridge, someone who could see both sides clearly because he approached them without the weight of centuries-old prejudices. He discussed mining rights with Martian officials, trade routes with representatives from the outer colonies, cultural exchange programs with delegates from Venus. Each conversation felt less like navigating a minefield and more like actually connecting with people who had genuine interests and concerns. Near the end of the evening, after most of the formal business had concluded, Valeria dismissed her courtiers. Tad watched from across the room as she moved once again to stand by the observation window. Not alone this time exactly, there were still people nearby but separated from the constant press of official attention. She looked out at the stars, and even from this distance, Tad could read the expression on her face. The same longing he'd seen a week ago. The same quiet hope that someone might ask instead of always being approached with agendas. Tad set down his drink and crossed the ballroom. People noticed his trajectory. Conversations paused. Eyes followed. But unlike the first time, the attention felt less like shock and more like interest, curiosity. Even from some quarters, something that looked like approval. When he reached Valeria, she turned to face him. Her expression was carefully neutral, but those dark eyes held warmth. "Your Majesty," Tad said, offering his hand, "would you honor me with a dance?" For a moment, she simply looked at him. And in that look, Tad saw everything they discussed and everything they hadn't. The complications they were choosing to embrace. The vulnerability they were both risking. The possibility that despite mortality and immortality, despite politics and positions, something genuine could grow between a grieving human and a lonely queen. "Yes, Mr. Brennan," Valeria said, placing her cool hand in his. "I would like that very much." They moved to the dance floor, and this time the crowd's reaction was different. Still some disapproval from conservative quarters. Still calculation about what it meant politically, but also approval. Younger delegates watching with expressions that suggested they were seeing not a breach of protocol, but a new kind of diplomacy. One based on genuine connection rather than calculated distance. An elder vampire from a neutral territory nodded subtly to Lord Cassius, who returned the gesture. Near the refreshment tables, several human officials were smiling. Even the algorithmic music seemed to respond, shifting into something that actually sounded happy. The music settled into a waltz, and Tad was pleased to discover he'd only stepped on her feet once so far. Definite improvement. "You've been practicing," Valeria observed, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Elliot insisted, said I needed to not embarrass Earth by dancing like I was having a medical emergency. "Your previous technique had charm." That's a kind way of saying I was terrible. I was going to say it had authenticity. They moved through the dance, and Tad was aware of how different this was from that first evening. Now he knew who she was. Now he understood the weight she carried. Now he saw the walls she'd built and was choosing carefully and deliberately to lower. And she saw him. Not just the fumbling diplomat with self-deprecating jokes, but the man underneath. The one who'd lost someone and learned to carry grief with grace. The one who chose kindness over calculation. The one who saw people instead of positions. "I spoke with my counsel," Valeria said quietly as they danced, "about complications. And they have agreed to support whatever choices I make, even if those choices involve risking my heart again." She paused. Lady Moraine shared something with me about her own loss centuries ago, about how the brief time she spent with him was worth more than all the years she's spent in safety since. Sounds like wise advice. It was, though terrifying to consider following. The best advice usually is. They danced in comfortable silence for a moment. Around them, the ballroom had relaxed into genuine celebration, conversations flowing more freely, laughter that sounded authentic rather than diplomatic. Even the algorithmic music had found something approaching real melody. I meant what I said, Valeria continued, about creating our own protocols. These past 200 years, I've been following rules designed to protect me, rules that kept me safe but utterly alone. Perhaps it's time to consider different rules. What kind of rules? The kind where vampire queens can dance with kind humans without every interaction being analyzed as political strategy. The kind where we can simply enjoy each other's company without calculating outcomes 7 moves ahead. She looked at him, and vulnerability flickered across her ancient features. The kind where I'm allowed to care about someone again, even knowing it will eventually hurt. For what it's worth, Tad said quietly, I think that's very brave. Choosing to feel despite knowing that, wow, that's harder than staying numb. You would know? Yeah, I would. The music began to wind down, transitioning into its final movements. The evening was drawing to its natural close, with delegates beginning to make their departures. But this time the ending felt less like goodbye and more like the conclusion of a beginning. Next month, Valeria said as the dance ended, there's another function, more formal than this one. It would be appropriate for Earth's liaison to the Sanguine territories to attend. I'll be there, probably won't cause any diplomatic incidents between now and then, but I make no promises. I would be disappointed if you became too diplomatic, Mr. Brennan. Your particular brand of chaos has proven refreshing. Tad laughed. I'll try to maintain appropriate levels of chaos, Your Majesty. As they stepped apart, Valeria's courtiers began to materialize, drawn by some invisible signal that their queen was preparing to depart. Lord Cassius offered a respectful bow to Tad, not the perfunctory acknowledgement of before, but something that looked almost like approval. Lady Moraine smiled openly. Valeria inclined her head with formal grace. Until next time, Mr. Brennan. Until next time, Your Majesty. She turned to make her farewells to the evening's hosts, her courtiers forming their protective formation around her. But before she moved too far away, she glanced back. Just once. Just for a moment. And in that glance, Tad saw everything that mattered. Not promises they couldn't keep. Not certainty about an uncertain future. Not pretending that mortality and immortality weren't real obstacles. Just the simple truth that they'd both been existing in safety for too long, and were now choosing, despite complications, despite grief, despite every practical reason to protect themselves, to risk living instead. Elliot appeared at Tad's elbow as Valeria's entourage departed. You know this is going to be complicated, right? Extremely. Political ramifications, cultural differences, the whole mortality thing. Yep, and you're okay with that. Tad watched Valeria disappear through the ballroom's main entrance, her black gown flowing like liquid shadow. He thought about Elizabeth, about what she'd want for him. Not eternal safety, not careful protection from all future pain, but the courage to keep living, to keep connecting, to keep choosing hope even when hope was terrifying. Yeah, he said, I'm okay with it. Well, Elliot raised his glass. Here's to diplomatic chaos and terrifying hope. I'll drink to that. Across the ballroom, delegates were making their final departures, returning to ships and stations and the complex business of interstellar politics. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in ways that would reshape treaties or redraw territorial boundaries, but in the small, profound way that happened when two people chose vulnerability over safety. When a queen remembered she was a person first. When a grieving diplomat decided that existing in safety wasn't the same as living. When someone asked and someone else said yes. Valeria stood at the viewport of her flagship, watching Meridian Station grow smaller as they departed. Behind her, Lord Cassius reviewed the evening's diplomatic outcomes, agreements, affirmed the relationships, strengthened the usual careful dance of interstellar politics. But Valeria's mind was elsewhere. 200 years, she thought. 200 years of telling herself that walls were strength, that distance was protection, that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything. And then a fumbling human diplomat with terrible jokes and genuine kindness had asked her to dance and reminded her what she'd been missing. Not romance necessarily, not yet. The future remained uncertain, complicated by every practical reality of their different existences. Tad would age, and she wouldn't. His life would be measured in decades while hers stretched across centuries. The mathematics of their connection seemed designed to guarantee eventual heartbreak. But perhaps heartbreak was the price of actually living. Perhaps 200 years of safety had taught her that avoiding pain meant avoiding everything else worth experiencing. Perhaps despite all the logical reasons to protect her heart, she was ready to risk vulnerability again. Your Majesty, Lord Cassius had finished his report. Are you well? Valeria turned from the viewport. Her senior courtier looked at her with the same concern he'd carried for 2 centuries, ever since Jonathan's death, had taught him to watch for signs of her withdrawing into herself. But this time, instead of the careful neutrality he'd grown accustomed to, he saw something different in her expression. Something that made him straighten slightly, as if recognizing a version of his queen he hadn't seen in a very long time. She smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine and completely unlike the diplomatic expressions she'd worn for so long they'd become her face. Yes, Cassius, for the first time in 200 years, I'm more than well. I'm actually looking forward to something. The next diplomatic function. Among other things, she looked back at the viewport where Earth hung like a jewel in the darkness. Do you know what Thaddeus said to me tonight? He said that choosing to feel despite knowing the cost was braver than staying numb, that it was harder but more worthwhile. He's not wrong. No, he's not. Valeria was quiet for a moment. I've been queen for 347 years. I've negotiated peace and prevented war. I've done everything a sovereign should do. But for 200 of those years, I've been existing rather than living, functioning rather than feeling. And now I'm choosing something different, choosing vulnerability over safety, choosing the risk of eventual pain over the certainty of continued numbness. She met her courtier's eyes. I know it terrifies you. It terrifies me too. But Cassius, I can't spend another 2 centuries being safe and alone. I won't. Lord Cassius studied her for a long moment. Then something softened in his severe features, something that looked almost like relief. Your Majesty, I have served you for over a century. In all that time, I have never seen you as happy as you were tonight, dancing with him, laughing without calculation, being Valeria instead of just Queen Valeria. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If this human, this Thaddeus Brennan, gives you that, then I will support it, even knowing it will end in grief, even knowing I will have to watch you hurt again. Because I would rather see you live 50 years and grieve than exist for another 2 centuries in safety and solitude. Valeria felt something warm unfold in her chest. Thank you, Cassius. Though I reserve the right to worry, professionally, I would expect nothing less. She turned back to the viewport, watching stars wheel past as her flagship adjusted its course. Somewhere on Meridian Station, Thaddeus Brennan was probably being debriefed by his superiors, trying to explain how his complete ignorance of protocol had somehow resulted in a diplomatic breakthrough. The thought made her smile. Next month there would be another function, another opportunity to dance, another chance to choose vulnerability over safety, connection, over distance living, over merely existing. The mathematics still didn't make sense. Human lifespan versus vampire immortality. His mortality versus her eternity. The certainty that one day sooner than felt possible, she would watch him age and fade while she remained unchanged. But Lady Moraine had been right. The brief time was worth more than all the endless years of safety. And perhaps Valeria thought that was the real bravery. Not protecting yourself from pain, but choosing to feel despite knowing pain was inevitable. Not building walls that kept you safe, but lowering them despite the risk. Not existing in careful solitude, but daring to connect even when connection was temporary. 347 years she'd been alive. But perhaps finally she was ready to truly live. She allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in 2 centuries, the simple pleasure of looking forward to tomorrow. To next week, to next month's function, where a kind human diplomat would ask her to dance, and she would say yes. Not because it made political sense, not because it advanced strategic interests, not because it was safe or logical or guaranteed to end well, but because sometimes the bravest thing a queen could do was remember she was a person first. Because sometimes the right choice was the one that felt like hope instead of calculation. Because sometimes after 200 years of existing in safety, Choosing to live, really live, was worth any cost. Valeria stood at her viewport watching stars wheel past in the darkness and felt something she thought she'd forgotten how to feel. Hope. And for now, that was enough.